All right. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Tonight we're gonna kind of shift gears a bit and dive deep into a period of American history that's, well, let's be honest, it's often told in a very kind of black and white way, but it's so much more complicated than that. I'm talking about the Civil War. We're going to try and look past that simple North versus South narrative and see what else we can uncover.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what's really fascinating is we've been digging into some excerpts from this podcast
Yeah.
called Legends and Lies, American Civil War Beyond North versus South. And let me tell you, there's a whole lot more to the story than what usually makes it into the textbooks.
Totally. And that's kind of the whole point of this deep dive, right? We want to uncover those hidden layers, the stuff that doesn't always get talked about, and maybe even challenge some of those, those stories we think we know about the Civil War.
It's all about getting a more complete picture, you know, because when you really start to look at the economic factors and the different loyalties people had, and, well, there's some myths we need to bust too.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So let's kick things off with this idea of beyond North versus South. The source material really emphasizes that while the Union and the Confederacy were obviously the main players, it wasn't as simple as just picking a side. It mentions all these shades of gray, contradictions and untold stories.
It's like, yeah, you had those two big forces clashing, but then within those forces, there are all these other dynamics at play. The sources really highlight that while obviously slavery was the core moral issue driving the conflict, there were so many other factors mixed in. Economic differences between the regions, political ambitions, and then the loyalties within communities, families even got so tangled. It's just a much more complicated picture than just North versus South.
Absolutely. And speaking of economics, that's one area where the source really flips the script. We tend to think, okay, industrialized North, agricultural South, but then it throws in this curveball, talking about how parts of the Confederacy actually had strong Union sympathies. And get this, some Northern businesses were profiting from Southern slavery. It's like, whoa, wait a minute, what?
It's kind of mind-blowing, right? It really shows how economic interests could sometimes completely overshadow even moral and political stances. Like, think about the textile industry in the North. They relied heavily on Southern cotton, which of course was produced using slave labor. So you had this situation where some Northerners were pushing for abolition, while others were directly benefiting from the system they were supposedly against. It makes you realize that the economic landscape was so much more intertwined and honestly hypocritical than we often imagine.
Yeah, talk about a tangled web.
Right.
And it wasn't just internal economics either, right? This whole thing was playing out on a global stage. The source material really digs into the role of banking, international trade routes, and foreign investment. And then there's the whole issue of Europe, specifically Britain and France, and their dependence on American cotton. Why were they so crucial in all of this?
Well, think about it. If Britain or France had decided to back the Confederacy, which they seriously considered, it could have been a game changer for the Union. Their economies were heavily reliant on Southern cotton, so the Confederacy saw them as potential allies. But in the end, they remained neutral, which honestly was a huge win for the North. It really highlights how international economic factors had the potential to completely reshape the course of the war.
It's wild to think how different things might have turned out. And then there's the whole question of race and loyalty during this period. One thing the source material really drives home is that enslaved people were not passive bystanders in all of this. I mean, you read about their bravery, their escapes, and the huge role they played in the Union Army as the United States colored troops. It's incredibly inspiring.
Absolutely. The formation of the USCT was a turning point. Not only did they provide much-needed manpower for the Union, but their very presence challenged the Confederacy's whole ideology about the inferiority of black people. Their courage and sacrifice were absolutely essential to the Union victory. And then there's this other detail in the source material that's kind of hard to wrap your head around. It mentions that some free black men in America owned slaves themselves.
Yeah, that one really makes you think. I mean, it shows that while race was clearly the defining factor in slavery, it wasn't always the only factor at play. You have to consider the economic realities of the time, the complexities of social hierarchies. It's a reminder that history is rarely neat and tidy.
Right. It's a very nuanced and uncomfortable truth. It highlights how power dynamics and economic circumstances can create these incredibly complex and sometimes disturbing situations. And the source takes it even further by looking at Native American tribes. Their involvement in the war wasn't a simple story either.
Not at all. I mean, you had tribes like the Cherokee and the Creek who got caught up in this conflict, and their loyalties were all over the map. Some sided with the Confederacy, hoping to secure better treaties and protect their land. What were they thinking, choosing that side?
Well, you have to remember that these tribes had their own long and often fraught history with the U.S. government. They had their own goals, and some saw aligning with the Confederacy as the best way to achieve those goals, even though it meant siding with a cause that ultimately supported slavery. It was a strategic but often tragic decision based on their understanding of what they needed to do to survive.
It shows just how multi-layered the whole conflict was. And then you had immigrant communities, especially the Irish, who faced this whole other set of challenges, particularly with the draft. What was their experience like?
For a lot of Irish immigrants, the Civil War was this incredibly difficult situation. They were already facing discrimination and poverty, and then they were being forced to fight in a war that, to many of them, felt like someone else's fight. It led to resentment, protests, even riots against the draft. It really highlights the diverse and often conflicting perspectives that existed even within the Union itself.
It's a reminder that there were so many different stories playing out within the larger narrative of the war. And speaking of narratives, let's talk about Abraham Lincoln. The source material kind of challenges that traditional image of him as the great emancipator. What's the more nuanced view?
Well, it's important to remember that Lincoln's views on slavery evolved over time. Initially, his main goal was preserving the Union. The Emancipation Proclamation, while incredibly significant, was also a strategic move. It only freed slaves in Confederate territory, not in the border states that were still loyal to the Union.
Why do you think he made that distinction? It seems like he was walking a very fine line, trying to keep those border states on his side. Issuing a blanket emancipation order at the beginning might have pushed them towards the Confederacy. It's a good example of how complex wartime leadership can be, and how even morally important decisions are often shaped by political realities. And speaking of a divided South, the source reminds us about West Virginia, which actually seceded from Virginia to stay in the Union. What does that tell us about Southern unity?
The fact that West Virginia even exists is a testament to how deeply divided the South actually was. The western counties had different economic interests, fewer slaves, and a distinct cultural identity compared to the East. Their decision to break away shows that the Confederacy was far from this unified, homogeneous entity that's sometimes portrayed.
It's like even within the South, there was this whole other layer of division, and it goes even deeper than that. The source mentions these secret pro-union networks operating within the Confederacy. That's not something you hear about very often. What was their role in all of this?
Those networks were actually really important, even though they were working in the shadows. They provided intelligence to the Union, helped prisoners escape, and generally stirred up resistance within the Confederacy. Their very existence challenges that idea of a totally unified South, showing that there was dissent and opposition even within enemy territory.
It really flips the script on how we usually think about the war. So the fighting eventually ended in 1865, but the story didn't end there. The source touches on the Reconstruction era and all the challenges that came with it. What were some of the key issues during that time?
Well, you had this massive task of rebuilding a nation that had been torn apart, especially in the South. And then there was the question of how to integrate formerly enslaved people into society. Reconstruction saw some progress in terms of civil rights for Black Americans, but those gains were short-lived. The rise of Jim Crow laws led to decades of segregation and systemic racism. It's a tragic chapter in American history.
And the economic impact of the war was huge, especially in the South. It took a long time for them to recover.
Absolutely. The Southern economy was devastated. The shift away from slave labor, while obviously necessary, created massive upheaval. And the slow pace of industrialization meant that the South struggled economically for generations, contributing to the disparities we still see today.
It's a reminder that the legacy of the Civil War is still very much with us. It's there in our politics, our culture, even the debates we're having about monuments and how we remember history.
The Civil War was a defining moment in American history, and its echoes are still felt today. The debates about states' rights, racial justice, what it means to be an American, these are all issues that were at the heart of the conflict, and they continue to shape our national conversation. It's a reminder that history isn't just something that happened in the past, it's something we're still grappling with today.
So I guess the big question is, after hearing all this, does it change how you think about the Civil War? Does it make you question those simple narratives we've been taught? And what do you think are the most lasting impacts of those divisions, those echoes that still resonate in America today? It's something worth reflecting on for sure.
Absolutely. The more we learn about the Civil War, the more we realize how complex and multifaceted it was. It challenges us to move beyond simplistic explanations and to grapple with the full weight of its legacy. And that's a conversation we need to keep having.